Hello again, my name is Dr. Frederick Bright. I'm a physician licensed to practice medicine in the state of Georgia. I have followed the Malachi Z York case from the onset during the arrest in May of 2002. I was contacted by the family as a medical expert in order to review the medical information in the accusations that was provided to the defense by the government. My review of this information was complete, and in December of 2002 I arrived at my medical opinion based on the information that was provided at that time. The medical information at that time was complete and never was updated beyond what was received in December of 2002. In my opinion letter during that time, I stated that the consistent inconsistencies in the medical history from the alleged victims led me to the conclusion that there was a problem with those histories. In other words, the histories were not medically what was expected for the type of complaints or allegations that the victims were stating had occurred. Additionally, there was a complete absence of any DNA forensic evidence, or there was a complete absence of pregnancies of any of these alleged female victims who were of childbearing age, despite the astronomical number of allegations of sexual molestation and assault that were apparently stated to have taken place. I subsequently served as the defense expert witness during the federal trial in January of 2004. During that trial, I provided testimony about my findings during my review through the month of December of 2002. Again, please note that the information that I expressed in my medical opinion in 2002 was offered to the court, and it was not used or not favorable in obtaining bond for the defendant at that time. At the trial in 2004, there were many irregularities that were apparent with regards to the way the trial was conducted, with regards to the testimony that was being given by the victims, and with regards to the way the information in the trial was being allowed. In other words, the defense was basically limited by the judge who disallowed certain information in, and some of this information could have been critical in arriving at an innocent verdict for the defendant. Nevertheless, my medical opinion and my medical testimony was submitted to the court. Before I go on and express those, I first must give you a little background about child molestation or sexual molestation cases. In cases of sexual molestation or assault, it's normal that victims undergo a forensic medical examination within 72 hours after an alleged assault has occurred. This window of time allows for those victims to undergo an exam in which forensic evidence such as DNA can be obtained from the genital regions of the victims or whatever body organ has been contacted with the alleged perpetrator. In this particular case, there were no examinations undergone anywhere near that 72-hour window. In fact, after a thorough review of all information, it became clear that there was not even a precise day given in any of these allegations of when the alleged assaults occurred. In other words, there was just given a non-specific period such as the summer of 1999 or the fall of 2000 when these alleged acts occurred. Additionally, this absence of a timeline for these alleged assaults to have occurred allows for significant alteration of the history, and also can put a massive amount of doubt on the timing of the assaults, which can in and of itself lead to the alleged perpetrator being considered guilty of a crime which he may not have committed. In other words, if you have a victim who states that the alleged attack happens at the age of 15 and 10 months, and they state that, oh, the assault happened in the summer of 1999, and they turned 16 during the summer of 1999, you have actually deprived the defendant of an opportunity to use the proper age as a defense in those allegations. In other words, if the alleged victim turned 16 during the summer of 1999 but did not give a specific day for the alleged crime to have been committed, it deprives the defendant of the opportunity to use the change of age from adolescence to adulthood as their defense. And this was clear in all of these allegations. There was no specific time frame for any of these allegations. This point was brought up in the court. Additionally, when a medical examiner evaluates an alleged victim, it's imperative that one obtains an accurate history of the contact that allegedly occurred. When that is absent, an examiner cannot do a thorough examination, for they do not know which body surfaces were involved in the allegations. Again, in this case, because of the significant gap between when the actual allegations took place and the time of examination, the medical examiners did not have any real ability to evaluate the body orifices that were involved in the acute stage of the alleged event. Okay, so this again puts a considerable opening for the prosecution to simply say, well, it happened just the way we're saying it, and they don't have to be held accountable for any real specifics that are normal for a sexual molestation case. Additionally, there was no forensic evidence of any type linking Malachi York to any of the victims in this case. Forensic evidence would be that such as DNA, which could clearly show if the defendant had had sexual contact or body fluid exchange with any of the victims. There was a complete absence of forensic evidence. Additionally, although many of the alleged victims in this case were of reproductive age and female, there never was any pregnancy stated to have occurred during the multiple years in which these alleged events took place. With regards to the direct evidence that was available for my review, some of the significant irregularities I'd like to now present to you. For number one, there were absolutely no recorded interviews or statements of any of the victims that the prosecution offered to the defense. Now, we live in the most technologically advanced society on the planet for the most part. Recording devices are available to even the most poor county in any state of the country of the United States, but yet in this particular case, there was not a tape recording, not a videotaped interview, not even a written statement from any of these alleged victims. There were only secondhand investigative notes written by the federal and state detectives in this case. What this allows to happen is that the investigators, when questioned in court, can easily say, if there's contradictory evidence, well, I just took the history wrong, or I may have made a mistake in my notes. In other words, the absence of a record prevents the defendant from having the ability to, in essence, impeach any of the witnesses' testimony. This occurred in this case, and it was quite dramatic with the number of allegations that occurred for the federal and state prosecutors to have no recorded evidence, video, audio, or written evidence. And this allowed a significant amount of information to be introduced, but was not verifiable. Additionally, as mentioned before, there were no specific times obtained for any of the alleged acts, simply time ranges. In other words, the crime occurred in the year 1999 sometime. This significantly impacts on the ability to find a reasonable doubt by the jury, and is in most cases totally unacceptable. This is tantamount to having a crime and saying, well, someone stole my car in the year 2000, and it doesn't give anyone a chance to even present an alibi in their defense. This was done for all of the alleged victims in this case. Additionally, with the allegations that many of these alleged victims stated, there should have been a past medical history of injury to the genital or to the intestinal tract. These victims, or alleged victims as we call them in the medical community, stated that they had injuries to their vagina or to the anal area, which resulted in bleeding. Whenever there's bleeding, it implies that there has been a significant laceration to these particular areas of the body. In spite of these allegations, there was not one medical record of any of these alleged victims ever visiting a hospital, a clinic, or any facility for any traumatic injuries in the genital or anal region, despite the multiple allegations which we've described. Either the healing effect of the intestinal tract when there are injuries is totally inconsistent with what one would expect with especially anal injuries, because if anyone has ever even had a hemorrhoid, it's clear that when you have injuries to the anus, they do not heal very well due to the excessive amount of bacteria that are in that body organ. Again, to restate that, there were no medical historical records of any injuries having been obtained. And again, this allows an alleged victim to simply say anything and have no evidence with which to back it up. And it's highly inconsistent with the type of allegations that have been stated in this particular case. And I presented that evidence to the jury in this case. Additionally, with regards to the histories in this case that the alleged victims provided to the detectives, there were consistent inconsistencies with regards to how the traumatic injuries to the genital tract or to the intestinal tract manifested themselves. To put it more plainly, if one has an injury to the anus and one does not rest that body cavity and continues to traumatize that area, the injury does not just get better within a day. It requires a prolonged period of rest in order to heal that body organ. This history was completely absent in all of these alleged victims. It was as if the victim stated, I was injured today and tomorrow I was okay, I could tolerate the repeated episodes of sodomy that were perpetrated by the defendant in this case. This is totally inconsistent with a traumatic injury. And as anyone would know, if you have an injury, the cure, it has to rest for it to heal. This was not evident in any of the histories with these alleged victims, and this was highly irregular. Additionally, the prosecuting investigators in this case made statements throughout the record that they knew these alleged victims had been molested, and they used this information to force some of the alleged victims into foster care during the initial period of this investigation. In other words, they made the statement that they were certain each and every one of the victims in this case, many of whom denied the allegations, they made the statements that they were certain that these young adults had been assaulted. The only way an investigator could be certain of an incident having occurred would be if they directly witnessed that event occurred. Nevertheless, the prosecuting investigators, some of them in this case, made statements that they were certain these children had been molested. And this is impossible unless you were an eyewitness. But in essence, they stated that they were an eyewitness, and that was inconsistent with the reality in this case. Additionally, the Child Protection Service examiners made statements in their histories and physical exams that the histories of the victims or alleged victims were consistent with molestation having occurred. These statements were made even for alleged victims who denied that there had been any molestation. In other words, for an investigator to state that a history is consistent with molestation having occurred, the first criteria to fulfill that requirement is that the alleged victims state that they have been molested. In many of the cases, at least half of the cases in this particular matter, the alleged victims were reported to have been molested by an outside party. The alleged victims themselves, who had been named as alleged victims, denied that they were victims. Nevertheless, the investigators with the Child Protection Services stated that the histories were consistent with molestation having occurred. And this is in direct contradiction to the facts. If the history states that there is no molestation, that is the history. There is no molestation. Nevertheless, in an effort to condemn this man prematurely, these investigators stated that the histories were consistent with molestation, despite the fact that the histories offered no evidence that the children or young adults had been molested. This again was highly irregular and almost tantamount to a witch hunt. Additionally, the Child Protection Services made statements such as the physical exam findings were consistent with molestation. These statements were made when there was absolutely no evidence of any injuries to the vagina or anus or any signs whatsoever of molestation having occurred. When questioned by the defense about these allegations on the part of the investigators, the Child Protection Services witnesses could not explain how the absence of injuries is consistent with molestation and the presence of molestation is consistent with molestation. In other words, no matter what findings they obtained on examination, in their investigation they stated that their findings were consistent with molestation. In other words, whether there's evidence or not, it's consistent with molestation. And this was used in court to help convict this individual, Dr. Malachi York. With regards to specifics within this case, many of the alleged victims were mistakenly described by the wrong gender by the investigators in this case. There were at least 3 females who had been examined while in the Department of Family and Child Services custody, who were stated on record as being male. This shows a complete disregard for accuracy with regards to the investigative services personnel. To state that a female is a male in a case of this severity is completely unacceptable and worthy of those investigators being dismissed from the Child Protection Services. Additionally, these same investigators stated on record that there were video or picture evidence obtained on the evaluation of many of these children or young adult victims of child molestation. When the defense was presented with all of the discovery evidence in this case, there was never provided one picture, one videotape with which an independent reviewer could evaluate the findings obtained by the Protection Services for Children in Georgia. This is despite them stating on record that the videotape and picture evidence exists. This led me to the conclusion that either the evidence was eliminated through throwing it away, or the evidence never existed but was stated on record to exist. This in and of itself should lead one to have considerable doubt in any of the evidence presented by the prosecution in this case. Another point that was brought up in this case was that the government who investigated these allegations made an assumption that the parents of all of the alleged victims who resided in the village where the initial raid took place, it was assumed that these parents were a party to the molestation. These parents who, simply because they resided in the village, they were essentially deprived of all parental rights simply because they resided in the village where Malachi York taught class. He was not even a resident of the village, but everyone that was a parent of any alleged victim and that parent resided within the village, they were deprived of all parental rights simply due to the fact that they resided within this peaceful village. With regards to victims or alleged victims who did not reside in the village or on the property, those parents or guardians were allowed to be part of the investigative service provided to their children. So in other words, any adults who did not reside in the village were allowed their parental rights, but any adults who resided in the village were deprived of their parental rights, with no allegations being brought against those parents. This is totally unacceptable. This is prejudicial on the part of the investigators, and this is worthy and warrants a complete investigation by the Georgia State GBI as well as federal investigators. Additionally, there were multiple allegations of sexual molestation as brought forth by the alleged victims in this case. The number of molestations may be anywhere from 4 to 12 times per day. What these alleged victims are stating is that a 50-year-old man or greater than 50-year-old man suffering from a life-threatening illness was able to engage in sexual activity on a daily basis with multiple young adult victims 5 to 12 times a day without any ramifications to himself. In other words, he sounds like a Superman with regards to his sexual prowess. And this is someone suffering from a life-threatening, potential respiratory life-threatening illness. And this is totally not the norm for anyone over 50 years of age. This was presented in court. Finally, one of the most unusual facts in this case was the fact that many of the alleged victims completely and to this day deny that they were victims of molestation. Despite this fact, the government continues to refer to those young adults denying they were molested as child molestation victims. This is totally a disservice to those young adults. It has labeled them as being victims of child molestation. The restitution case has been started, and the government is looking to deprive Dr. York of financial ownings because of restitution to victims who deny that they're victims to this day. And this is, again, highly irregular. To summarize, despite the multiple inconsistencies in this case, the multiple denials of molestation by many of the victims in this case, despite the many irregularities in this case with regards to the way the defendant was painted as a militia or a criminal of the likes of Al Capone, despite the fact that this trial was closed to the public, and now despite the fact that the transcripts of this trial have been locked by the federal court. The truth must be told, and I'm here presenting this information to you, having served as a defense witness, to make the public aware of what the government is capable of doing. And because Dr. Malachi York was having such an impact on the youth and bringing people together, it's clear that they went beyond the norm in order to bring about this unjust prosecution. And it is our hope that the truth will eventually be told as we pursue the appeal in this matter.